This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of School Judgment 1 and A Drifting Life. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two academic kind of guys talking about manga. And on this month's episode, we're going to be looking at a couple of interesting titles. We're going to start with a new book from Nobuaki Enoki and Takeshi Obata, School Judgment, number 1. And then after that, we're going to look at an older work and a much longer work, Yoshihiro Tatsumi's A Drifting Life. But before we get into a discussion of those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those titles are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some great specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts can get more impressive than that.
Yeah, like this month you can get the Viz Big editions of Rurouni Kenshin for 30% off, and you can get volumes of Bakuman by an artist we'll be talking about today, Takeshi Obata, for 30% off as well.
That's right. You know, you can always count on great prices, whether it be Western, English language, comics, or manga as well. So Discount Comic Book Service's website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics and manga, which are really comics, pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your manga there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, you know, the last time we did a manga show, we started off by mentioning that it was a little later. So our January manga episode came out the first few days of February. And the way that things happened in February is, now we are recording this technically in February. This is February 29th. It's a leap year. But this is not going to go up until probably March 1st. Mm-hmm. I think I can get it up in time for the first day of March. So it may be up and published on March 1st, but this is really the February manga episode.
Yeah, so hopefully March we'll get ourselves on track, but yeah.
And, you know, it's just, it's life things that get in the way. Both January and also February, both of us have had a lot going on and a few bumps along the way. This happens, but we ultimately get the episodes out to you guys, not only because we like to be reliable, but also both Shea and I love manga.
That is true. We are fans of manga.
Yeah. You know, and speaking of fans of manga, and especially manga fans who listen to the podcast, we got a letter from one of those guys, and this is someone who has written to us in the past, Paul Spence. He sent us an email the other day. In fact, he sent us a couple, and I want to kind of combine some of what he says in both of the emails. Hi, Derek. I've been listening to all the manga podcasts over the last week, and I heard the one about Assassination Classroom today. And that was from a few months ago, in fact. It turns out that Multiversity put up a lengthy appreciation of Assassination Classroom from a writer who thinks it trumps the Wolfman Perez Teen Titans. Well, there you go. Based on the podcast, I wanted to pick up Assassination Classroom, and that decision was reaffirmed after I read this recent article. And then he gives a hyperlink to the Multiversity article. So I followed up and said, thanks. You know, I'm glad that we're helping you to find new manga. And then he writes a follow-up to that. I know that I picked up the first volume of One Punch Man because of the podcast. I'm also interested in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Der Weltgelder. In January, Sarah Horrocks wrote a terrific analysis of De Velgelder and gives a hyperlink to that. And then he says Jeff Lester of the Wait What podcast also wrote about it in a January publication as well, and he gives the link to that. And then he concludes, it appears the comics alternative are both tastemakers and very attuned to the manga zeitgeist of the moment. Yours truly, Paul. So that's cool. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, that's always nice to hear from people. And we were talking about this earlier, but I like being told that I'm a tastemaker. That makes me feel good on the inside. So I appreciate that.
See, that's cool. And Andy Kunka and I have called ourselves tastemakers in the past on the regular podcast, but this is the first time that someone else calls us a tastemaker.
That's right. So maybe there's something to that.
It could be. It's not just us being Donald Trump and tooting our own horn.
Oh, I would have thought that we were already not Donald Trump.
Yeah. Oh, come on! It's true. It's true. We're huge.
I mean, I like to think we are huge, but in every other sense, we're not. I think both of us, we don't have comb overs, we don't have hair pieces, and we're not, authoritarian fascist.
Fascist, yeah. The other podcast, they're losers. They're losers. Come on, really? It's true. I mean, low energy. You listen to those? You listen to that stuff? Okay, I'll stop right there. And see, no, this is scary. And this is going to seem a little weird in terms of timing. Earlier today, I recorded this week's regular review show, which is actually the March previews episode, before this one. And my co-host of that episode, Paul Lai, and I, and especially me, kind of went off on Donald Trump. And I told myself after that, it's like, okay, I won't do that when I do the manga recording with Shea in another hour or two. And I'll be damned if I slipped into a critique of Donald Trump.
Hey, he's disrupted politics to the point where, his fellow Republican candidates are hoping to win by insulting the size of his penis. So
God, oh man.
I will give you the benefit of the doubt. Donald Trump, He's a disruptive force in all of our lives.
Exactly, and he's disrupting this podcast now. So maybe we should move on.
Yes, his name is verboten on this podcast.
Okay. But names that are not verboten are those creators of the first title that we're going to be discussing, and that is School Judgment, Book 1. This is written by Nobuaki Enoki with art by Takeshi Obata. And if you're familiar with Obata's name, it's probably because you may have been familiar with a little series that he illustrated not too long ago called Death Note.
Yes,
and he's done other things as well.
Yes, I keep meaning to pick up his adaptation of All You Need Is Kill, which is a manga adaptation of a novel, which was also adapted into a Tom Cruise movie. But yeah, without a doubt, Death Note is probably going to be the book that is most well known from him.
Yeah, and in fact, on the cover of this first volume of School Judgment is the words "from the creator of Death Note." So, if you didn't know any better, you may think that Enoki may have been the creator of Death Note, but it's Obata, the artist, who is behind Death Note. But this is a very different book from Death Note. Now, let me ask you: have you read Death Note?
I have not. I have not gotten a chance to actually read anything by Obata. I have. I've been a fan of his art, and I've seen pages from Death Note, and I've seen pages from a number of other things that he's written and drawn, and some pages from his art books. But I've never actually gotten a chance to read any any full length work from him.
Yeah. I read, I think, the first 4, maybe 5 volumes of Death Note. And that's one of those series that is doable. It's containable. In other words, it doesn't go on for 40, 50, 60, 70 volumes. And in fact, several years ago, when my son Zach, who's now a fellow student of yours at UT Dallas.
That is right.
He doesn't read manga much anymore, but at the time he was kind of hot and heavy into manga, and he wanted the entire set of Death Note. So one Christmas we got that for him, and he really wanted me to read what he was so excited about. And I read the first 4, maybe 5 volumes. I liked it, and I can't remember now why I didn't go on to read the entire series. It's a different kind of work from School Judgment. It's much darker. But it's something definitely to check out. Maybe in a future episode, if we're looking at an older work, we can look at that big series.
Maybe. So you mentioned that it's different from Death Note, but why don't you try? Because I was thinking about this before we started. How would I describe the plot of School Judgment? So I'm curious how you would describe this first volume.
That's a good question. Because from the premise that I'm about to reveal, I would think, without having read this first volume, and this is what actually I did think when I read the solicit for this on Viz Media's website, and we didn't mention that the publisher is Viz Media, that how the hell is this going to be something I'm going to be interested in? It just doesn't seem likely. It seems a little too far-fetched. And it's not as if on these manga shows we haven't dealt with series that are far-fetched. I mean, I think a real far-fetched premise is Assassination Classroom, again having to do with classroom activities, kind of like School Judgment. But as we discussed several months ago when we looked at, what was it, the first 5 or 6 volumes of Assassination Classroom, that it was a very sophisticated series. And so when I saw the premise to this, I was a little skeptical because of this. This is the premise. In this society, in Japanese society, various schools, that especially elementary schools that have had disciplinary problems of one form or another, have decided that the best way of bringing perpetrators to justice, in other words, those students who are disruptive, who harm people, who cause problems in one way or another, the best way to bring them to justice is to have their fellow students judge them in a courtroom-like setting. That being the case, they get school kids, elementary school kids, to become the lawyers, and they try their fellow students who have committed these crimes or caused these problems. They also get young kids, and in fact even younger kids, to be the judges. Now, that's the basic premise, and it just seemed so wild and out there, I wondered, what kind of read would this be? I was pleasantly surprised after I read this first volume.
That is interesting. I totally agree that it is it's the most like almost stereotypically manga premise. It's so absurd to the point of like insanity almost.
Right.
But it is even when you look at the specific cases that are being kind of disputed in these three stories that are in this first volume, they're even crazier than that premise. I mean, the third story, which is either like a truncated story or it continues into the second volume, I couldn't really tell, but it's about kids getting addicted to essentially like crack cocaine.
Yeah. Okay. Now you say that there are 3 stories. I thought that there were 4, and the 4th one was truncated because, the 4 cases that we have right now, and I'm looking at the table of contents. Chapters 1 and 2 are the Suzuki murder and dismemberment case. Chapters 3 and 4, the pretty idol Ari Takanashi photo voyeurism case. The chapters 5 and 6 are the Shuichi Hikashida cheating case, and then the one that you were referring to that we only have the first part of is Beware of the Magic Powder. Now, of those 4, or at least 3 complete and what seems to be the 4th incomplete cases, that incomplete one, Beware of the Magic Powder, seems the most serious. It has the most gravitas. It seems to have the most real-world connection. Because the others seem, I don't know if lighthearted is an appropriate word, but it definitely, those other cases have a different tone. Maybe more jovial in a way, more humorous. So, for instance, this first case, the Suzuki murder and dismemberment case. Now, already it sounds horrific, right? That we have someone who has been murdered and dismembered. Well, it's not a person. It's a fish named Suzuki. And basically what we have here is a particular classroom, and this is a classroom, the setting is Tenbin Elementary School. And so in one of the classrooms at Tenbin Elementary, you have a class that is keeping, and they have a name for this exercise. I can't remember what the name of the exercise is.
I can't recall either.
But they keep a live animal and they learn about what it's like to raise it and care for it, and then later on to use it for some kind of purposes. Now, in this case, it's a fish, so they're going to use it for sushi. So they take care of the fish, and the fish is distinguished by having a star on its cheek. And people, or at least some people in the class, become so attached to the fish that they can bring themselves to kill it and make it into sushi. And basically, the class is divided along gender lines. So all the girls want to keep the fish alive and just keep it as a pet. All the boys want to eat it. And so that becomes the premise for this case, the Suzuki murder and dismemberment case. So little things like that, either lighthearted, kind of relatively innocent, humorous in many ways. But it's a little different when we get to that last one that we only have what seems to be the first half of, and I guess the second half will be in this next second volume, Beware of the Magic Powder, which does have very serious drug use connotations.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that the tone of the stories is lighthearted, and I think that's accurate. The way the stories are kind of played are very they're very flippant. They're very jokey and lighthearted, but the kind of subject matter that they address is really strange. It's a really strange tone to bring to these things, like the second story, you have a character. You have a pretty
idol, Ari Takanashi photo voyeurism case. That's a mouthful.
You have a character being accused of basically installing cameras in this school to take kind of lewd photos of this classmate. And not really lewd. Well, I mean, the first scene in the story is this kind of school administrator kind of like ogling this student, and so they are kind of like, I mean, they're not like explicit photos or anything like that. That's true, but they are kind of like sexual in nature.
Okay, I see.
And that's a weird thing. And the character's accused because he has a history of like flipping up girls' skirts and looking under their skirts. And that's like kind of serious subject matter. But when you consider that these characters are 12, it becomes really kind of upsetting that like you have 12-year-olds doing this to one another or accusing one another of doing this to each other. It's really weird. But, and then you have like in the fourth story, you have these characters getting again, 12, 13-year-old characters getting addicted to this. It's basically like the powder they put on Dorito chips, but it's basically cocaine. It's called white powder. People get addicted to it. They suffer withdrawal from it. And the character who's addicted to it looks like kind of like a cliched drawing of a crackhead.
Right.
And so there is this weird kind of dissonance between this subject matter that really is very quite serious, and then it's presented in this very kind of humorous, lighthearted tone. What did you make of that kind of like that? There is this separation between the subject matter and the way it's presented. What did you make of that?
Well, okay, I when it comes to this last story, or at least the half of what I'm assuming will be a story that goes into the second volume, Beware the Magic Powder. I mean, I do think that that's not so humorous. I mean, I do think that that's serious. And I think that the way that it's presented, the tone and the content, all of it is a little heavier than the other things in the story. I disagree with you a little bit on the voyeurism case. I do think that out of context, it is a serious and much more disturbing premise, right? Mm-hmm. Sexual exploitation, voyeurism, taking explicit photos, getting off on those photos, videos. However, within the context of this elementary school class, you even mentioned flipping up the skirts. Even that is presented relatively innocently. In other words, it's one thing for young kids who have no sense of what sexual exploitation is to tease someone or to flip up a skirt. And I mean, I'm not saying that's completely innocent and it's taunting, even considered, maybe exploitative and bullying in certain ways. But it's not the same thing as older kids doing this or an adult doing this to a young kid, right? Mm-hmm. It seems innocent enough. And the way that both Enoki and Obata present it, it does have a kind of innocent feel to it. In other words, the one character, and I can't remember his name, that's known for being a skirt flipper, right? We realize that he's also very much in love with one of the little girls that he is antagonizing. And there is something quite innocent about that he's not doing this to get his rocks off, right? Because he's not able to yet. He hasn't reached puberty. And so there may be the potential darkness lying underneath, but because this is presented within an elementary school setting, I didn't get as disturbed by that story as I did the Beware the Magic Powder one.
No, I think you're totally right. The Beware the Magic Powder is because not only is it so like kind of nakedly about like actual drug addiction in this very serious way, but there is this kind of like heel turn where it is there. I mean, there are jokes in it, but it is presented more seriously than the other stories. I think that's a fair point. But I don't know. I just couldn't help but kind of be kind of skeeved out by the kind of casual way this, what is essentially like sexual assault is just kind of like, oh, that's totally normal behavior. And I think the problem is that in a lot of places in the world, that is totally normal behavior, and that's why kids continue to do that. I don't know. There was something about that story, the fact that the behavior these kids were exhibiting, and the fact that it was handled like a joke. Not that like, that's innocent, but you have to understand that like you can't do that. It was just like, that's totally cool. Kids do that. What's the problem? So I think there was something kind of like, there was something off about that story in the way that it handled that subject matter to me.
Okay, and that's a good point, and I definitely see where you're coming from. Now, here's something that I wanted to throw out there. I was thinking of this as you were talking just now, and I want to see what you think about this. Now, one of the reasons maybe for me that this comes across, this particular story, the Pretty Idol Arahi Takanishi photo voyeurism case, doesn't disturb me as much, maybe because it's in manga form. And what I mean by that is not all manga, and the vast majority of the manga that we discuss on this show is not this way. But it strikes me that there is quite a bit of manga out there that is exploitive in a similar manner. In other words, it's definitely not uncommon to present even grown women as young schoolgirls with very short skirts, with very revealing tops, even young girls who were very well endowed. In other words, very sexually explicit representation of the women, especially the young women, in many manga titles, especially when the young women look like schoolgirls. Okay, so that brings me back to this particular story. When you have young elementary school kids teasing one another that if they were adults would be, considered, sexual, predator activity.
Mm-hmm.
It may seem innocent enough here, but I'm wondering if there's something embedded in certain kinds of manga where this has become a little more accepted and not as disturbing, or maybe I'm completely off base here.
Oh no, I will be the first to admit I'm approaching this totally from kind of a Western American 21st century perspective, and it is fair to remind or be reminded and remind others that the sexual politics of Japan are absolutely totally different from what they are in the United States, and I am in no way an expert on them. I have maybe some knowledge about them. Like I understand that they have they mythologize kind of the eroticism of rape and sexual assault in a way that we don't, or we've kind of like toned down here. But yeah, I think the point you raise is that it is what we see in this story is certainly a common thing that readers will see in other stories and in anime and in some Japanese live action movies. That's absolutely a fair point. And I do think it is important to make clear that my criticism of that and my reaction to that is totally rooted in the differences in sexual politics and gender politics between the kind of context that I exist in and the culture I exist in and the kind of context that this work arises out of. Okay. Because you're right, you do see that, you do see similar things like that in a lot of other works, and it's really common to see these very, very young women rendered by artists as these very sexually and physically mature characters.
Right. And I think it's for that reason that maybe a lot of adults with kids who know nothing about manga may not be keen on having their young kids read manga for this very reason. But maybe they're just looking at the wrong manga, not the kind that you and I discuss on this series.
Yeah, I think we have, for the most part, avoided works that I think a lot of people in the West would consider maybe exploitative or kind of like kind of gross and pervy.
Last week we discussed Panorama Island. So
I mean, well, yeah, you got me there. But pervy in a different way.
In a more sophisticated way, let's say.
In a more sophisticated, in a more erudite way.
Right.
I think, we've mentioned a couple times already in the show that Obata is definitely the kind of the name on this book. He is. I mean, when you mentioned this book to me, and we started kind of talking about it on the show, Obata was really that kind of selling point, and the fact that you had read Death Note, and I was certainly familiar with some of his work. What did you make of his art in this one? Because it is a lot different from what I've seen of Death Note and from some of his other works.
In many ways it is very different from the style of Death Note. And what I did, now I don't have my Death Note books with me, but I went on Amazon and, you can, for some of the books that they sell, you can preview sample pages. And so I went through some of the sample pages of one or two Death Note volumes. Strikingly different in that Obata's art in School Judgment is lighter. It's not as detailed, so it's more iconic in nature. Although there are certain illustrations where you get more detailed, a darker tone, things look a little more realistic, and that's when things get creepy, really. And so the kind of detailed, darker, and as I'm calling creepier side of Obata comes out, the Death Note kind of Obata, in certain places. Now, I can't remember. I can't see what page. Oh, it's page 76. Not all of the pages have numbers in this first volume, but on page 76, and this is the second chapter, which is the second part of that first case of the Suzuki murder and dismemberment case. And you have the classroom teacher. Are you on that page? Do you see what I'm referring to?
Yeah. I know which one you're talking about.
God, look at that face. My God. That is enough to give anyone nightmares. You get a teacher, and basically what's going on right here, and I don't want to give anything away, so I can't say too much, but one of the lawyers, and we haven't even talked about them yet, and I want to in a moment, they're recounting a story of what they think had happened in trying to solve this case. And so as they're kind of retelling what they thought may have happened in this murder and dismemberment case of the fish, they're representing the teacher, and the teacher looks freaky. She has these really big eyes. She has her mouth open in kind of a Joker-like grin, and her tongue sticking out. And the angle that we have of this vision is like it's from in front of her coming down, so it's like a high angle shot. In film, and it just looks freaky, and she looks freaky, and the art here is very detailed, and it's darker than most of the rest of the book. But there are other instances of this where Obata's art becomes darker and more detailed, more photorealistic in nature, as opposed to more iconic. And I think he does that. That's what marks for me as more Death Note-like. And when he does that, that's when things get serious. And a little darker and creepier in School Judgment. So it both is and isn't the kind of art that we see in Obata's Death Note.
Yeah, I picked up on those panels. There's a couple like that throughout, and I think that is I think for me the really aesthetically the high points of these books. I know you talked about it being very creepy, and I think your description of that page and that panel is very spot on. I was really reminded of that page, and then a little on the next page, as her face kind of as we get closer in on her face, and her mouth gets wider and wider, and her eyes get bigger and bigger, as this one lawyer is accusing her of something. I was really reminded of the work of Junji Ito, and there is
definitely,
yeah, there is that kind of grotesque, shocking aesthetic at work there. But those for me were really the what I enjoyed most about these books, because I think those panels, and there's a couple more throughout the book that are similar in like that in the way he changes up the way he renders things. I really enjoyed those panels because I thought they did an excellent job of communicating Obata's skill as a draftsman, and at creating this really strong sense of dynamism and movement, and in creating that really purposefully kind of creepy atmosphere that I don't think was really present, or those skills weren't really present in a lot of the rest of the book for me.
Yeah. And I think the word that you use, grotesque, goes a long way of describing the style that he demonstrates here. And you're right, it is very reminiscent of Junji Ito's work, and who also deals with the grotesque. Now we've been talking about, for the most part, the premise and the setting of School Judgment, but we haven't really talked about the characters. And in this first volume, at least, there are three main characters. And we're introduced to them at the very first chapter. Now, the two main characters are, or arguably the two main characters, are the two lawyers that come, and they're transfer students. One is Abuku Inugami, and he is a defense lawyer. And then the other is Pine Hanzuki. I guess it's Pine or Pine, P-I-N-E. It looks, we would say pine, but I would guess you pronounce the E. Pine Henzuki, and she is a prosecuting attorney. And the difference between the two is that Pine is, well, she'd like to come across as this very girly, very feminine, very pretty, very almost exotic young girl that all the boys think is just so cute. In other words, almost the epitome of a cute manga girl. I read her as very much like a pastiche of
like the Sailor Moon type
yes,
of like
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Like magical girl characters. Because when she's introduced, I'm looking at the page now. She describes herself. Well, maybe it doesn't say it on this page. She describes herself as like a sailor or something. She uses that words that I'm looking for the page now. But when she introduces herself, she does give herself this. This title that is.
Oh, I see the page. Yeah, she is pretty she is pretty prosecutor sailor Piney.
Right, and that's like I think designed to kind of remind people or kind of invoke that character, that archetype.
Yeah, and then when she comes in many times into various stories, there's a big production. I mean, she even has an assistant that backs her up and sometimes literally provides backdrops for her. But that's the way she presents herself. But there's also a dark and nasty side to her when she gets angry, and a competitive side as well. And so she is the prosecutor. Now, the other lawyer who's a transfer student at the same time is Inugami. And he arguably is probably the most interesting character in this story, in this first volume at least, in that we find out a little bit about his past. A third character that I wanted to point out, and his name is Tento Nanahoshi. He's actually the defendant in the very first case, the Suzuki murder and dismemberment case. And he ends up becoming Inugami's assistant. And he also is the narrating perspective for most of the narrative in this book. So we see things through Tento's point of view for the most part. And Tento at one point comes across some information about Inugami's past, and things look a little iffy, a little suspicious. Big question marks, but they're never answered in this first volume. And I think this big mystery behind Inugami is going to be what carries over into the second and third and maybe the Beyond volumes. And so I think that's one of the things that's going to have me potentially reading further. I haven't decided yet if I want to go on to read this, but I think that's really interesting. Another thing about Inugami, he's extremely, extremely competitive, and he's competitive in terms of argumentation. And in fact, what does he call it?
His
confutation. It's the Japanese for computation.
Rampa is his hobby.
Yes, he says, I'm going to rampa you. I'm going to rumpa the hell out of this. And so basically he's going to argue people to death. And he does. In fact, he has almost what comes across as an innate, almost unnatural skill at argumentation, even with the most mundane things in life. Because when we meet him fairly early in the story, the teacher is asking him why he doesn't want to eat his vegetables. And he goes off on her. He rumpas her. And basically shames her into backing down because of his logical, argumentative approach to things.
Yeah, he's even. It's interesting that you mentioned he has kind of like just his natural competency, because he is mentioned as that mysterious origin that you mentioned. He is one of like 5 children who didn't go to law school. They just trained themselves to be a lawyer.
Yeah, which
is like an insane concept.
Well, the entire premise of school judgment is an insane concept.
That is true. It really is. I mean, we've talked about some really bizarre books, but this, I think, takes the cake. I mean, his origin, his mysterious origin, is tied to the founding of this school arbitration system, which arises out of some vaguely mentioned school classroom massacre, which is like a really dark. It's like a really dark.
That's the mystery, yeah. That's going to propel us into subsequent volumes.
Yeah, and he's here to kill some student. But that's all the information he gives about himself, really. So it is. It's almost perplexingly weird.
Yeah.
I really didn't know what to make of it, because it was so, I couldn't believe what I was reading, because it is so comically insane, but then at the same time there are these kernels of very, very dark, very, very serious story beats. So would you? I know we were kind of like on the topic of characters, so we briefly mentioned that Pine or Pine is. I think she's clearly a pastiche of those magic girl characters. I mean, even when she introduced herself, we said she described herself as pretty prosecutor Sailor Pine. But just looking at that page again, the top tier of that page is 3 panels. And the text is, to acutely vanquish all manner of evil, using her wealth and intellect, she's the young hope of the judicial world. And it's the 3 panels are her kind of glowing in this transformative panel, which is reminiscent of the scenes in like Sailor Moon when the characters are transforming from their kind of normal clothes into their sailor outfits. And then the next is like a shot of her clothes, which are very reminiscent of those Sailor Moon outfits. And then she even wields a kind of staff with this kind of heart thing. So I think we can agree she's pretty clearly a reference or a kind of joke about those characters. But did you see Inugami as a sort of parallel to that or a foil to that? Do you think or did you see him as a kind of pastiche of a different archetype? Because I think that joke works really well for that character, for the Pine character, but it kind of falls apart because you don't see that kind of cheeky in-joke with any of the other characters, unless you saw something about like Tento or Inugami that I missed.
No, I didn't. With Tento, as I mentioned earlier, I see him as primarily the focalizer, not necessarily the narrator of most of these stories, although in some cases he's directly the narrator, but the focalizer, the vessel through which we get our information, the perspective or through whose eyes we see things going on. And I think that's what his significance is. Now, if he is a reference to another character type or types in manga, I'm not aware of it. Same thing with Inugami. If he's a composite in the way that Pine is, I'm not aware of it, and it could be that he is, but me not having the kind of background that maybe a lacking background in manga and manga history. I don't know. I mean, I haven't read Sailor Moon. I know of it, but apparently you know it a lot better than I do.
I have a Tumblr, so I see Sailor Moon GIFs and images on my Tumblr all the time. Yeah. So I am familiar with the basic concept and some of the images from it, but I wouldn't say I have a deep knowledge of Sailor Moon.
Yeah, but or maybe another manga that it somewhat alludes to is something like a Fruits Basket. Now, I did read the first volume of Fruits Basket. I didn't go on to read subsequent ones, but I know that that's a famous, fairly limited. I mean, there are not that many volumes of Fruits Basket. Now, I don't know if that is also a character type that Pine is alluding to. Now, it's okay with me if she is the one, let's say, satirical character in this book, and that Tento and Inugami aren't. That's fine with me. This is, I think, overall characters, premise, all of that, just kind of a weird and over the top manga. And you're right, we have discussed some strange setups in the past. I mean, I think that in some ways One Punch Man was kind of wacky. Definitely JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And one of the things that this reminded me about in terms of connecting School Judgment with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, we commented on there being a big emphasis on fashion and voguing. In JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, to the point that standing out and you're wondering all of a sudden, like, why are these guys suddenly voguing? Striking a pose. And every now and again this happens in School Judgment, especially with Pine, but even with Inugami. And I saw that as more satirical than anything. That basically what we have here is Enoki and Obata kind of making fun of manga by having this emphasis, especially with the character Pine, on fashion, on striking a pose, and being seen.
Yeah, I think there definitely is that. And Inugami does the same thing where he objection, and he throws his finger up like that, and
And one way of looking at this is, a lot of manga, or at least what many people think of when they think of manga, is, shonen. It's action. There's a lot of fighting and a lot of movement. Well, I mean, come on. The premise of this courtroom drama in an elementary classroom, how much movement and action can you have? Well, the movement and action is borne out through the movements and the posing and the posture of the prosecutors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's
and the defense attorney.
Yeah. There's like a kind of a rich history of Japanese of these like seemingly banal kind of concepts being kind of presented as these very action heavy, or kind of like taking on the visual kind of signifiers of action. There's the Phoenix Wright video game series, which is a live action movie, which is this kind of it's a video game series about a lawyer, about an attorney, and the main thrust of the games is you're litigating, which is a really weird, like, I can't if you told me that, I would. Well, kids don't want to play like a game where you like litigate for like several hours. That sounds terribly boring. But apparently, Japan has this rich history of these action oriented lawyer narratives that. But you're right. The kind of premise of School Judgment isn't that action, but it is played like it is. It's action heavy. Like the scenes. In the courtroom, and when they're researching the defense and stuff like that, they are drawn and presented as if this was like Dragon Ball or One Piece or Naruto. Like it was like this epic 250-page fight sequence between two ninja masters. But it's about these 12-year-olds who are ranpa-ing each other.
Yeah, exactly. And one other weird thing about this title that we haven't even mentioned yet is that the judge at this school, and this is judges in this arbitration system that we've been describing, are young kids. And in fact, this judge for the cases that we have in this first volume is 5 years old, although he looks like an old man. He has the face of an old man. And the way that this is described or explained is that because of all of the judgment that needs to be made with all the cases for these 5-year-olds, it wears on them. And once they stop becoming judges and just go on to be, young kids as any normal young kid would be, then they start to look progressively more their age. And so, in other words, they start looking younger. And again, this is kind of a weird premise, or at least one facet of a larger weird premise is that the judges are 4 and 5 years old, even younger than the elementary school kids that are prosecuting and defending the cases. Mm-hmm. It's just wacky all the way around. Yeah,
it's wacky is, I think, an apt way to describe it. It is very wacky.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this is a question that, we often ask each other every month. And I alluded to this earlier about whether or not I would go on to read subsequent volumes. Is this a title? Is School Judgment something that you're going to go on and read volume 2 and then 3, so on and so forth? Or is this first volume just the one taste and that's it?
I think for this one, it's going to be a one taste and that's it.
I got that sense from you.
Yeah, it is a book that I'm glad I got the opportunity to read it, because it is very, very strange, and it is at times very funny, but it is not what I would call good. But it sounds like you had a different opinion.
I do. Now, I'm on the fence as to whether or not I'm going to go on to read the next 1 or 2 volumes of this. I can tell you that upon reflection, I'm not sure if I'm going to or not. But as I was reading this, I was having a hell of a good time. And one of the things that struck me, and I became aware of myself having a good time because I didn't think that I would. I didn't think I'd have a bad time reading this. It's just, given what this was about, I wasn't sure. I was rather uncertain. But then in the middle of reading it, I enjoyed it, and I went through it fairly quickly because of that. And so it was like eating a great dessert. right? Now, after you eat that dessert and you realized all of the sugar that you just consumed and the butter and all of that, it's like, is that something I want to have again? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Is it good for me? No. So should I have it again? That's the kind of way I feel about School Judgment. I may want to go on to read the next 1 or 2 volumes, but I don't know if I will or not.
Well, there have been books in the past where our opinions have been flip-flop, where I've wanted to continue and you weren't so taken with the book. So
Yep.
It happens. We don't agree on everything.
True.
Was there anything else you wanted to add about School Judgment or wanted to cover? Or
No, I think I'm all done with School Judgment. But before we move on to the other title that we're discussing for this month, we should mention the other sponsor for this episode, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. If you read a lot of comics, you need to stay keen. You need to be acute. You need to be awake in order to get every aspect of the story, its references, the themes, the art, all of that. And there's no better way of keeping up with things and being awake than having great caffeinated coffee. Or, if you like the decaffeinated kind, you can also find it at Just Coffee Co-op. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade grown, and it's organic certified. On top of that, everything is roasted in small batches. They do no mass production whatsoever. If you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, that's justcoffee, one word, .coop, and at checkout, use the coupon code COMICS, that is COMICS. You'll get 10% off of your order, plus you'll be helping out the Comics Alternative. So it's a win-win-win situation, no matter how you look at it. That's justcoffee.coop. It's a great place to get caffeinated. So now, after that commercial break, let's jump into the second title that we're looking at for February, and this is A Drifting Life by Yoshihiro Tatsumi. And, every now and again, Shea, we have used our monthly manga series to look at not only new comics coming out, but to also look at some classics or some books from classic writers. I know we did this fairly early on with the Akira series, and we're doing it now with A Drifting Life because Yoshihiro Tatsumi is a manga artist that is now well respected, but I think early in his career, even into the 1970s and 80s, even in Japan, is someone that manga readers were really not familiar with, from what I understand.
He was someone whose work in the U.S. really only started getting translated in 2006, 2007 after Adrian Tomine kind of discovered his work and championed it at Drawn and Quarterly, which is why Tomine, I think, did all the design work for the Drawn and Quarterly books like Abandon the Old in Tokyo and The Pushman and Other Stories. So Goodbye. I think, it looks like Catalan Communications did translate Goodbye and Other Stories in 1988. But for the most part, he is someone who was very influential, particularly in the development of Gekiga, or alternative comics in Japan. He was someone who was very influential, but whose name was kind of unknown in the West until pretty recently. Yeah,
and from what I understand, not as respected in Japan as well. Just not that popular.
I think A Drifting Life is kind of distinct from the rest of his work in that it's probably the most accessible. I mean, it is the longest, and so it is kind of inaccessible because of its length. But in terms of its subject matter and the way it tells its story, it is probably the most conventional of his works, the most accessible of his work.
Now, you were mentioning some of his earlier works, and we should point out that those and others have also been published by Drawn and Quarterly. I think the first one that they published by Tatsumi was The Pushman and Other Stories, but they've also put out Abandon the Old in Tokyo, Goodbye, Fallen Worlds, and Black Blizzard. And all but one of those are story collections. The Pushman and Other Stories, Abandon the Old in Tokyo, Goodbye, and Fallen World. Black Blizzard, I think, is an early work of Tatsumi's, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a longer it's a longer work. It's not a big book, but it's not a short story, let's just say. It's not a novella. Whereas A Drifting Life, when you say that this is a long story, we have, not counting the notes in the back, 834 pages. Mm-hmm. This is a hefty tome.
It is. It is, we talked about a couple months ago Tezuka's Message from Adolf, and I think on the podcast we mentioned just how big those books are.
Yes.
And A Drifting Life is just as big. It's, I believe, I know this is the only edition that's been published in English, but I believe it was two smaller volumes when it was released in Japan.
With even more pages, because I guess they kind of decompressed the story a little bit in the Japanese form, in that when it was translated, it was condensed a bit. Because I remember reading, and it could have been in the introduction or at least somewhere, that when this was originally published, A Drifting Life, in Japan, as you mentioned, it was 2 volumes, and that each of... it was in the interview with Tomaini at the end. He mentioned, or at least... Or maybe it was an interview in one of these other books from Drawn and Quarterly, because in the ones that I've read, Abandon the Old in Tokyo and Goodbye, they're interviews with Adrian Tomaini, and he mentions in one of those, maybe not in A Drifting Life, that he's publishing both volumes of A Drifting Life in Japan, and he says that they're about 800 pages each, or at least 600, something like that. They're really long. Mm-hmm. But what we have is the entire thing in one volume in about 800 and not quite 40 pages.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. The only work of Tatsumi's I had read Fallen Words, and then I had read The Pushman and Other Stories, and I might have read Goodbye, but Abandon the Old in Tokyo is one that I haven't. So I had totally missed that interview with Tomaini.
And that's interesting, because I haven't yet read Pushman and Other Stories and Fallen Worlds, but I have read Abandon the Old in Tokyo and Goodbye, those story collections. Now, we've mentioned that most of these books that Drawn and Quarterly has been putting out is short story collections, and that's what Tatsumi is primarily known for, is a master of the short story form. And, Shea, you mentioned earlier that A Drifting Life, as long as it is probably his most conventional story. I think that's a great way of putting it, because you can read his other stories, almost any short story in the other collections we've mentioned, The Pushman and Other Stories, Abandon the Old in Tokyo, Goodbye, and they're quite unusual. And they're not unusual, or let's say edgy or alternative, if you want to call it that, because of the art style or because of anything that may be non-realistic or surreal. But the strangeness, so to speak, comes from its reality. In other words, his stories, Tatsumi's stories, his short fiction, I would absolutely categorize them as slices of life. And by that, I mean not just realistic, but it's like a certain episode or moment in someone's life. If you could just take that out, slice it out, so to speak, and then put that on display, what you would have is something with basically no opening and no closure. It just ends and that's it. Now, what kind of sense do we make of that little slice of story without its larger life context? It's kind of difficult, but that's the way that his short fiction comes across, if you read these collections.
Yeah, I think people who are listening to this who are familiar with Tomaini's work are gonna have a really good sense of what kinds of stories and the way Tatsumi tells stories.
That's a good point. But even Tomaini's stories seem to wrap up much neater than Tatsumi's short fiction or short manga.
That is true, and I wouldn't say that they are making identical work, and certainly I think Tomaini had kind of developed a narrative voice before, an authorial voice before he discovered Tatsumi. But it is really obvious to see why Tatsumi's work resonated so much with Tomaini, that he felt he needed to be the person to bring it to the United States. And the second story in the last issue of Optic Nerve was even dedicated to Tatsumi. So there's definitely differences, and I think that's a fair point. There are differences in the way they kind of structure their stories, but the things and the stories they choose to tell are similar in a way that I think people who are familiar with one will have a strong sense of what to expect from the other.
Yeah, and you're right there. I mean, there are definitely the similarities, although I do think that Tomaini is a little more conventional. And in fact, Tomaini's short stories have probably more in common with the longer novelistic, if we want to call it that, A Drifting Life, than with the short stories in Abandon the Old in Tokyo, Goodbye, and Pushman.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comparison.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've been talking about other things that Tatsumi has written, but let's get to A Drifting Life, because this is important because, as you mentioned earlier, this is Tatsumi's own story. It's his, for all practical purposes, autobiography, even though the protagonist in A Drifting Life is not Yoshihiro Tatsumi. The protagonist's name is Hiroshi Katsumi. And so, phonetically, it's not that different from Tatsumi, Tatsumi, but basically you have Tatsumi telling his story, but using a fictional stand-in whose life represents his, Tatsumi's, apparently in every way. Yeah,
I think I noticed that too, that he did change the names of his family members, and I assume a couple other people throughout the book. But it's pretty much a Romana clef. It is events that actually happened to this person, and really he just changed some nominal details to spare people feelings or what have you. But it is essentially the story of his life from about 1950 to about 1960.
Yeah, and you described it as a Romane clef, and you're right, it is. But I look at this as more of a Künstlerroman, which is a growth narrative of an artist. So if a Bildungsroman is, the story of growing up, then a Künstlerroman is the story of growing up as an artist. And so that's what we have going on here in A Drifting Life, because this is Tatsumi's story about how he became an artist. And the art, I think, is central in A Drifting Life, because other parts of his life that, let's say, most of us could probably relate to, definitely not the art for me, but, his relationships with girls becoming more mature, his friendships and whatnot, those seem to take a back seat to an emphasis on the art. And a good example of that is one of the very few exchanges he has in detail with a female character, and I'm looking on pages 490 and 491. Now, at this point, the character Katsumi, Hiroshi Katsumi, again, the autobiographical stand-in, is living with a couple of other manga artists. And what do they call it? Because they're being put up by their publisher in an apartment. And this is not, he hasn't gotten to Tokyo yet at this point, but they're away from home and they're living together. And what do they call it? A manga camp?
Yeah.
Yeah. And their apartment is, and basically the apartment is not only where they live, but where they supposedly should be doing a lot more work than they do from their individual homes. And this apartment is above a restaurant, and one of the women who runs the restaurant in this particular scene that I'm alluding to on pages 490 and 491 is bringing him his dinner. And so Katsumi is eating, and the woman is sitting right across from him. And she strikes me as someone who is a few years older than him. And she looks at him in one point, and she says, she wants a piece of his food that she's eating. She says, "Let me have a bite." He responds, "Okay." When this piece is done, that he's in the middle of eating, she says, "No, I want that piece." Katsumi says, "What?" She responds, "I want the piece in your mouth." And of course, he's nonplussed. And then she leans toward him, opens her mouth, and says, "Hurry." And he goes, but it's already been in my mouth. And then we have this close-up scene from the front of this attractive young woman with her eyes closed, opening her mouth, saying, "That's what I want. Come on, put it in my mouth. Chirp, chirp." he said, I'm not a mother bird. And then we have a close-up of this woman's mouth. But I'm your chick. And then he gets ready to put it in her mouth, and then you turn the page, and this is the closest to sex that we get in this book. And I think that this is a very effective and engaging scene of seduction. But it's an anomaly because this is about the only time we get something like this. And the reason that I'm pointing this particular scene out, outside of the, eroticism that goes on here, and I do think it's powerful in that sense. But it's the one part of his life that we really don't have, outside of this, much access to. All the story about his growth, his development, his maturity surrounds art, manga.
Yeah, I think the Kunstlerroman is actually a really good way to describe it, because it is essentially, it's not the story of his life, of Tatsumi's life. It really is the story of his development as a cartoonist, from his initial fascination with the work of Osamu Tezuka to the development of Gekiga, and then to kind of the dissolution of that kind of core group of Gekiga practitioners. So it really, really is about Tatsumi's life, and we get a peek of some of that work. I think we get a couple of actual pages from. It's called in the book Black Snowstorm, but it's published in the U.S. By John and Cordelia as Black Blizzard, which is one of his longer works. But it really is about the art, and like you said, there are a couple instances of kind of detailing his sexual maturation, but for the most part, it is a pretty it's a pretty almost ascetic work. I hate to say asexual work because there are those instances, but it's almost monastic.
Yeah, well, even his life and his relationship with his family, I think, is relatively tempered. Now, we get more of his background with his family in the first part of this book, specifically in terms of his relationship with his brother, who here is called Okimasa, or Oki, because there's a weird thing that's going on between the two of them in the first, quarter of this book. Oki is the older brother, and I think he is the middle of the three brothers, right? There's an older one, then there's Okimasa, and then Hiroshi Katsumi. And then they also have a younger sister, who's the youngest of the family. So we get to see some of the family dynamics, and we also get to see some of Katsumi's relationship with his father, because his father's a character in a way. So we do get to see a little bit of his family drama, but after the first quarter of this book, that's left behind. And we get the emphasis again on him as an artist. And so it's not just him and his family, or him and his sexual awakening or sexual development, or him and his educational or occupational outside of art endeavors. It's him and manga. It's him and Gekiga. It's him and his art.
I mean, you're right that the first quarter of the book is filled with a lot of family drama, particularly this kind of friction between him and his brother Oki, who is kind of laid up in bed with some vague lung illness. But even the scenes featuring his brother are very, very rooted in Tatsumi's relationship with manga. It's that friction arises out of this envy or jealousy that one feels for the other, or that Oki tore up Tatsumi's manuscript for his manga. So even that family drama is very, it's kind of resting upon this kind of undercurrent of Tatsumi's practicing of his art, and the way that those family relationships impact or affect his kind of motivation to work, what he chooses to work on, how he develops his kind of theories of manga that would develop into Gekiga and stuff like that. So it really is through and through really, really focused on his relationship to manga.
Now, we have mentioned the word gekiga several times in describing A Drifting Life, and maybe for our listeners, we should make some distinctions between, at least as Tatsumi is framing things, between gekiga and manga as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one way of defining or describing gekiga is, I think, a way that you alluded to earlier, alternative manga. In other words, manga that falls outside of the mainstream. But what you and I may consider the mainstream in contemporary manga is different from what Tatsumi considered mainstream as he was growing up and what he's writing about here in A Drifting Life. Because the manga that most people consumed, at least according to A Drifting Life, and this is primarily what I have to go on here, I really do need a more thorough knowledge base in terms of the history of manga, are primarily strip manga, where it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Shea, but that the manga that the character Katsumi and then his brother Okamasa get into at first is maybe the equivalent to our newspaper strips, right? Where you have 3 or 4 panels in, out, very short bits.
That's
not
pretty good.
But not syndicated. Not syndicated.
No. I think, again, my knowledge is probably a little more than the average Joe's, but again, I'm basically going off of Drifting Life, and it looks like that there were some serialized manga. But for the most part, they were these kind of one and dones. They were, I believe, in this format called the Yonkoma format, which is this kind of 4-panel vertical layout, similar to like a Peanuts or any other like 3 or 4 panel horizontal strips. But these were these kind of vertical panels because Japanese is obviously, read. The language is read differently and kind of written differently, and so that kind of informs that vertical rather than horizontal read. But yeah, I think that is a really good analogous kind of artifact that I think most Western readers would understand. They were really similar to, I think, what we would think of as comic strips, mostly kind of humor oriented.
Yes. That's what I was going to say. Another thing that strikes me about this mainstream manga for Katsumi is that not only are there short stories or short strips, but they're also kind of gag or humor based for the most part. Because when Katsumi and others, and we should mention that there are some actual real life manga creators whose names aren't changed, like Matsumoto, like Ishojima, and there are a variety of others, Seto, that become friends or associates of the fictional Katsumi, who is based on the real-life Tatsumi. Mm-hmm. And when they're proposing a new kind of manga, which Katsumi is calling gekiga, one way of describing this is, in some ways, I think, very genre-based. Maybe crime, adventure, action, but it's not – when you and I say alternative comics, let's say in an American or U.S., Canadian, or Western form, mm-hmm. I don't think people immediately think of genres. In other words, definitely not superhero, not horror, not mm-hmm. sci-fi, not fantasy, but maybe more real life or realistically based, or if it makes sense to you, non-genre, even though you could make the argument that – realistic narrative is kind of its own almost genre. Mm-hmm. But what they're talking about in terms of gekiga, which we've called alternative manga, seems to be in many ways very genre based, at least in some of its forms.
Yeah, certainly some of the things like the work that Tatsumi produced early on and the work that's kind of mentioned in the book are these kind of crime narratives. But it's important to note that like the gekiga movement was a number of things, because it did it shifted the manga industry towards this this kind of thing that had something for everyone. It kind of opened the market up to manga, to long form manga or longer form manga, to manga for adults.
Heavier themes.
Yeah. And darker themes and darker subject matter and more explicit subject matter. But also a number of kind of narrative, artistic, stylistic techniques, which is the big divide that Tatsumi has with his brother in the book, where his brother thinks manga should be its own thing and it should develop these kind of medium-specific storytelling techniques, whereas Tatsumi, much like the real-life Tatsumi, looked to film, and he looked at these cinematic techniques to kind of inform the way he wanted to draw time on the page, and he wanted to kind of show time in the flow of time and to speed it up and slow it down on the page. So there were a number of stylistic techniques as well, and this is actually my favorite period of Tezuka's career, where he felt he needed to kind of compete with this kind of emerging Gekiga market, and he let himself be influenced by all of these new narrative and storytelling techniques, and it led to work like Phoenix and Buddha and Dororo, where you get these really, really amazing page layouts that were the result of him feeling really competitive with people like Tatsumi and the kind of group that Tatsumi was running with at the time.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me about what you just said about Tezuka is that he makes an appearance in the first quarter of the book. Now, his name is mentioned later on at various places, but we really see him, in fact, we literally see him as a character in the first part of A Drifting Life. And this is when Tatsumi, through his fictional stand-in Katsumi, is recounting his interaction with the great Tezuka. And, you know, it's clear that Tezuka is someone that he looks up to, he wants to emulate. And what I find interesting about Tezuka, and you know, you mentioned the most interesting period of his for you, and that is when he feels challenged and to go beyond, let's say, his comfort zone of, you know, Astro Boy would be a great example of, you know, typical early Tezuka, is when he does more experimental work. We don't get that side of Tezuka in A Drifting Life. In other words, he's mentioned in the last half of the book a few times here or there, but we don't get a sense of Tezuka himself challenging himself as a creator. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's a reason for that, because this is Tatsumi's story.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that the way he draws Tezuka is Tezuka almost looks like a Tezuka character. Mm-hmm. He's rendered slightly differently than
looks
than
a
other
more
characters.
Rounded.
Right, he has that kind of bulbous nose that's going to be very familiar for people who have read a lot of Tezuka work. But you're right, it's not Tezuka's story, and he slowly, as Tatsumi, that kind of mirrors Tatsumi's own personal kind of slow divorce from that kind of school of cartooning and that ethos. Tezuka slowly kind of plays a smaller and smaller role in Tatsumi's narrative.
Yeah. And, you know, another thing that you said a moment ago that made me think of, you know, one of the great things about A Drifting Life is that when we get to see the character Katsumi as not just a manga creator, but as a manga theorist. Now, you were mentioning that the divide between Katsumi and his brother Okimasa is one between, you know, Okamasa wanting manga to stay within its own medium, right, and not look to other forms of media for inspiration, whereas Katsumi is saying, hey, what about the influence of film? Because as we learn, Tatsumi, or Katsumi in the fiction, is a avid film watcher, in not only Japanese films, but also Western films. And so he picks up a lot of technique, he picks up a lot of visuals, he picks up a lot of character and narrative elements from watching these films, and he wants to include it in his manga, which goes a long way of differentiating that manga in general from what he wants to do, Gekiga. Another side of Katsumi as a manga theorist comes out when he is having a disagreement with, and I can't remember who it is. I don't know if it's Matsumoto or Sato, but it's one of his friends competitors, let's say, and the other person thinks of Gekiga as completely separate from manga, whereas the way that Tatsumi is looking at Gekiga is as a subset of manga. That if we're going to draw this as a Venn diagram, and it is at one point drawn as a Venn diagram to show this kind of critical divide, is that Tatsumi or Ketsumi sees the larger circle of manga and then the smaller circle of Gekiga within the larger circle. So it definitely is manga, but it's a specific kind of manga. Whereas his colleague, and again, I can't remember who it was who has a differing view, thinks of, if we're going to look at this as a Venn diagram, the circle of manga and then the circle of Gekiga completely separate, no overlaps whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is a conversation with Masahiko Matsumoto, who later develops his own kind of splinter style of cartooning called Komaga, which translates to panel pictures.
Okay, so it was Matsumoto.
I believe so, but that is an interesting conversation because, I mean, semantically, there is a pretty they are discrete things, right? Because the translation of manga is whimsical pictures, but then Gekiga is dramatic pictures, and so there is that just the words themselves imply this kind of discrete separation between the two. You know, like how can you have whimsical pictures how can dramatic pictures be a subset of whimsical pictures? Mm-hmm. But the book is filled with these conversations and this theorizing that I guess is just kind of a recollection of actual theorizing that went on by Masahiko Matsumoto and Yoshihiro Tatsumi and by Tatsumi's brother, that I was really taken with, because then that separation between manga and Gekiga and different kind of aesthetic styles and narrative styles are really fascinating to me personally. But they were the kinds of things that struck me about the book. They were the kinds of things that struck me about the book that I couldn't really see kind of just a casual reader really being into. You know, there's 50, 75, 100 or more pages of this giant book filled with this kind of stuff that seemed to me like the kind of thing most readers wouldn't have very much interest in. What was your kind of read on those scenes' place within the narrative?
Well, I loved it because what that made is A Drifting Life is a book that covers a lot of territory. Because on the one hand, it is a personal growth story, and it's also, as we pointed out, the story of an art form. You can also look at this book as a historical narrative, primarily surrounding one individual's life. But I think there's a larger history being told here. But another way of reading this, yet another, is as a critical discussion on what manga is. And so I think you can bring a lot of those different perspectives into your appreciation of A Drifting Life. And that's one of the things that I absolutely loved about this book. And so if we were going to look at any Tatsumi as our very first book of his, I'm glad that we started with A Drifting Life. Now, maybe later on we can do Goodbye and that collection of stories, or Pushman and other stories. But I'm glad we started with A Drifting Life. And by the way, a quick aside, we've been mentioning Matsumoto a few times. Did you know that Top Shelf is soon going to be publishing Matsumoto's Cigarette Girl?
I did not. I knew that Breakdown Press, who published Ding Dong Circus, which we talked about a little while ago, they
Speak about alternative.
Yeah, they had published a bunch of work that Matsumoto had put out in Garo, which is kind of an alt manga magazine that, again, we've talked about on earlier podcasts, that Tatsumi was involved with for a number of years. So I was aware that there was some extant publication of Matsumoto's work, which I'm not sure if it's in print or not, but I did not know that Top Shelf was going to be bringing even more out. Yeah,
that's why I think it's so interesting. It's that it's Top Shelf, and in fact, in this month's, or at least the March previews catalog, you can actually find a solicit for that. And for those of you playing at home, it's on page 189 of the March previews catalog. So yeah, I mean, that's something we should definitely consider for a future manga series episode.
Absolutely, I am. like the Garo stuff, so I'm totally into that.
Yep. But getting back to Tatsumi's Drifting Live, I can't say enough good things about this book. You would think that it being as long as it is, and as I mentioned, without the notes at the end, it's not quite 840 pages, that this would be a long slog. I didn't think it was. Now, when you read this, did you think that there were points where the story flagged or your attention and enthusiasm flagged, or were you carried through in an energetic way throughout?
The length of the work was interesting to me because, like we've talked about earlier, Tatsumi is really mostly known for his short stories. And most of the work that we've read from him have been his short stories. And I'm a big fan of those short stories and those shorter works. I think that's a form that he really knows really well. And it's a form that's really well suited to the types of stories he likes to tell. And I didn't feel so much that the work, that A Drifting Life was too long. But since I finished it, I've been trying to kind of figure out how I feel about the length. Because I do think that Tatsumi works better in that shorter format. But then at the same time, I also kind of wanted A Drifting Life to be longer because I do think the ending left me a little bit unsatisfied. And I would have liked to have seen more of the narrative or a stronger ending. So I feel simultaneously that the work was too long, but also not long enough. So I'm still trying to figure out exactly how I felt about the length. What about you?
It's interesting that you mentioned the ending, because when I asked you if you thought that the storyline sustained itself throughout, I wasn't thinking of the ending, but now that you mentioned it, I think the one thing about this book, I don't want to say I was dissatisfied by, but I found, let's say, the least convincing, okay, comparatively speaking. I still liked it well enough, but again, the least convincing was the way that the book ended. Now, not counting the epilogue, which we can get to in a moment, and this is not a spoiler in any way. And in fact, I don't know if a book like this you could have a spoiler, but it ends with a Tatsumi, or the character Katsumi, still relatively young, successful manga creator. And he ends up at a protest rally in, the early 1970s, because it's a protest rally outside of the Japanese Parliament. Is that it? Yeah, House of Representatives. In fact, they have the date here. May 20th is when they signed a new security treaty with the United States. And so this is going on during the Vietnam War, and you have a lot of students outside protesting. And the character Katsumi finds himself drawn to this protest, and even though he has no intentions of becoming a part of the protest, in other words, yelling outside of the House of Representatives, he ends up doing so. And it's as if his political commitment at this point, because he hasn't been a political character at all throughout. And that's one of the things that struck me as a little unusual about this story, is like all of a sudden he becomes committed politically. And so in one way it struck me kind of like a Jean-Paul Sartre narrative, right? That, you have a character that's kind of drifting along. This is called A Drifting Life, until a critical moment where they make a political commitment, or what Sartre would call engagé, right? And so it's almost as if we were going to read this as an existentialist story, which I don't, then this moment would be the time when the artist figure, Katsumi, decides on literature engagé, committed literature or engaged literature. And that's what one could potentially take away from the ending, when you have this artist figure becoming part of what seems to be an important political movement. But then that ends, and then we get the epilogue, which takes place years later. In 1995, the 7th anniversary of Tezuka's death, and Katsumi is there at an event honoring Tezuka, and when we see an older, perhaps wiser Katsumi, we don't see his face clearly. In other words, an adult or a more adult Tatsumi is masked from us, which I found an interesting literary device, artistic device as well. And so I kind of liked that. I don't know if the epilogue filled in or made up for, or whatever you choose, however you choose to describe it, for the ending. The ending seemed, with that protest outside of the House of Representatives, a little different from what I was expecting. I'm not saying it's bad; it's just different from everything else that came before. And the epilogue didn't help me to get a better grasp on what to make of that ending. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, I felt pretty similarly. Like it was just kind of it doesn't really tie up any of the narrative threads together in a really strong way. It is this very impotent ending. It's not very conclusive. It doesn't leave you with anything. It's very much like just another scene in the book. And it's presented as if, just like the other scenes in the book, like something is going to come in next. Like there's going to be another scene. It did feel like it was just kind of like chopped off.
Yeah. But see, in this way, this really long book, of over 800 pages is very much like his short stories that we see in The Pushman, Abandon the Old in Tokyo, and Goodbye, in that they just end. There's just a cutoff. You expect something else to happen, but that's it. The story's over. And you don't have any comfortable closure. And so, I'm wondering, for a writer like Tatsumi, who is this cutoff, this lack of closure is part of, I think, his style. How are you going to end a long autobiographical narrative? Are you going to end it in a similar way? I think you could make the argument that he does.
And I think that is a fair point, because you're right. It is very much a piece with his other works, but at the same time, like I was saying, it is. I think that kind of ending, that abrupt ending, functions much better, and it's. In a shorter work, it's much sharper and much more pointed in a work that's 10, 15, even 20 pages than a work that's 834. The narrative kind of bows under the weight of that minutia. At a certain point.
That's a good point.
And so it is something that I think, like I said, it is a work that I would have liked to have seen more from, because I felt like the ending was a little unsatisfying. But at the same time, I think he works much, much better in the shorter form, because filling 834 pages with that level of quotidian detail does kind of wear thin at a certain point. I think the book was filled with these really interesting things and these really interesting scenes, and it's a book that I enjoyed immensely, but it did kind of reaffirm my belief that Tatsumi he works strongest in that shorter, more pointed format of the short story.
Yeah, exactly. And we should also point out to our listeners that Tatsumi died not too long ago, not even a year ago.
Yeah, he and yeah, I know Shigeru Mizuki just died, and then Tatsumi died not too much before that, but yeah, these guys. This book does take place in. I think it starts in like the mid 40s, maybe the late 40s.
Yeah, right after the Second World War ends.
Yeah, so these guys they're certainly getting up there in age. Shigeru Mizuki was like 93 at the time when he passed. So yeah, and Tatsumi lived a long life.
Mm-hmm. So there you go. For the month of February, we looked at a new title and an older title. We started off with Nobuaki, Enoki, and Takeshi Obata's School Judgment, Volume 1. And then we looked at an older text, A Drifting Life by Yoshihiro Tatsumi. And also a much longer book than School Judgment. So, I'm glad when we look at two new releases, Shea, but I also like it when we use these manga episodes to look at a new title and then an older one.
Yeah, I think that's a format that I enjoy quite a bit as well.
Yeah. So we had a good time talking about manga, and we hope that we get you interested in manga just as we get Paul Spence interested in several titles. And if you want to find out some great prices on manga, you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. They have a lot of great deals on manga. Check them out. You can also check out the website of our other sponsor, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. If you go to justcoffee.coop, that's justcoffee, one word, .coop, you can find a variety of great coffees, teas, and chocolates. Put them in your shopping cart, and when you check out, be sure to use our coupon code COMICS. It'll give you 10% off of your order, and remember, shipping is free. And then after you do get your manga and your coffee and tea, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about the manga, coffee, and tea that you get from those great guys. You can get in touch with us by going to the website, comicsalternative.com, and you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way, over the phone. Our number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Shea, how can they get in touch with you?
I am Shea at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also get in touch with us via a variety of social media outlets such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find, as always, every single one of our episodes as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com. So, Shea, there are a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, and we appreciate it when we hear from you guys.
We really, really do.
That's right. And you don't even have to call us tastemakers. You can disagree with us. You can curse us if you want. You don't have to be as kind as Paul Spence was.
But we would appreciate it if you were as kind.
Yeah, that would be nice. It strokes our egos. Now, we will be back for our March show, and we anticipate being on time then. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you next month.